Commander Jake Morrison stood at the observation window of the UES horizon and stared at the wreckage floating in the darkness of space. The pieces of metal and debris drifted slowly past his view, and each fragment told a story of destruction that made his stomach turn. New Haven Colony had been home to 50,000 people just 3 days ago. Now it was nothing but scattered ruins spinning endlessly in the void. Lieutenant Amy Carter walked up behind him with a data pad in her hands. Her face was pale and her eyes were red from crying. She had friends on New Haven, and Morrison knew she was struggling to maintain her composure. The entire crew was struggling. They had arrived expecting to deliver supplies and share news from Earth. Instead, they found a graveyard. Morrison turned to face her and waited for the report he knew would bring no comfort. Amy took a deep breath and began reading from the pad. The attack had been systematic and brutal. The enemy had targeted the civilian shelters first with weapons that burned so hot they melted the protective domes in seconds. Families had been incinerated in their homes while they slept. The children in the colony school had no chance of escape. The defense platforms that protected the colony were destroyed next, but only after the people were already dead. It was not a military strike. It was murder. The security footage recovered from a damaged satellite showed everything. Morrison had watched it once and refused to watch it again. The ships that attacked were unlike anything in the human database. They were sleek and organic-looking with hulls that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent light. The weapons they fired were not lasers or missiles but streams of superheated plasma that could cut through reinforced steel like paper. The ships belonged to the Zilithian Collective, and that name was now burned into Morrison's mind with hatred. Dr. Peter Lane was in the science lab analyzing the weapon signatures left behind in the debris. Morrison went to find him because he needed answers. He needed to understand why this happened and who was responsible. Peter was hunched over his console with dozens of screens displaying data about the alien technology used in the attack. He looked up when Morrison entered, and the expression on his face was grim. The Zilithians were a species humanity had encountered 10 years ago at the edge of explored space. Every attempt at communication had been ignored. Every diplomatic envoy sent to their territory had been turned away without explanation. The Zilithians made it clear they wanted nothing to do with humans, and most people in the Earth government assumed they simply wanted to be left alone. That assumption had cost 50,000 lives. Peter explained that the weapon signatures matched the most advanced Zilithian biotechnology on record. These were not pirates or rogue elements acting without authority. This was an official military operation using their best equipment. The Zilithians had decided to wipe out New Haven Colony with deliberate precision and overwhelming force. They had committed genocide, and there was no other word for it. Morrison asked the question that had been haunting him since they arrived. Why would the Zilithians do this? New Haven was a farming colony that grew food for the outer settlements. It had no military value and posed no threat to anyone. The people there were families trying to build a new life far from Earth. They were farmers and teachers and engineers. They were innocent. Peter had no answer to that question. None of the crew did. The Zilithians had attacked without warning and without making any demands. They simply appeared in the system and began killing. When the colony defense force tried to fight back, they were destroyed in minutes. The entire attack lasted less than 2 hours, and when it was over, the Zilithians left as silently as they had arrived. Morrison returned to his quarters and began writing his report for Earth Command. His hands shook as he typed, and he had to stop several times to compose himself. The weight of what he was about to unleash sat heavy on his shoulders. He knew how Earth would react to this news. He knew what the governments would demand. He knew that his report would start a war. Humanity had not fought a major conflict in over 60 years. The colonies were peaceful, and the exploration of space had united Earth in ways that centuries of diplomacy never could. But Morrison also knew the history of his species. He knew that humans were capable of terrible things when pushed too far. He knew that throughout history humanity had always responded to atrocity with overwhelming force. The Zilithians had made a fatal mistake. They had looked at humanity and seen a young species that could be bullied. They saw colonies spread thin across the stars and assumed humans were weak. They did not understand that humans had spent millennia fighting each other in the most brutal wars imaginable. They did not know that humans had survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear weapons. They did not realize that the reason humanity sought peace was not because they were incapable of war, but because they were too good at it. Morrison finished his report and attached all the evidence they had gathered. The security footage and the weapon analysis and the images of the destroyed colony. He marked it with the highest priority classification and sent it on the fastest communication relay to Earth. The message would reach Geneva headquarters in 18 hours. The response would come within days. As the Horizon prepared to leave the system, Morrison took one last look at the ruins of New Haven. He thought about the families who had lived there and the dreams they had carried with them from Earth. He thought about the children who would never grow up and the future that had been stolen from them. He made a silent promise to their memory. The Zilithians would pay for what they had done. Earth would make sure of that. And when the response came, it would be so terrible and so absolute that no species in the galaxy would ever make the mistake of threatening humanity again. Morrison did not know exactly what form that response would take, but he knew it would be devastating. The Zilithians had wanted to show humanity its place in the galactic order. Instead, they had awakened something that should have been left sleeping. The Horizon jumped to faster than light speed and left the graveyard behind. But the memory of New Haven would travel with them back to Earth, and that memory would ignite a fire that would burn across the stars. The Zilithians had declared war on humanity without understanding what that truly meant. They were about to learn that humans did not fight wars to win territory or resources. Humans fought wars to ensure that anyone who threatened them would never threaten anyone again. Admiral Kate Sullivan sat in the war room deep beneath the city of Geneva and watched the holographic displays flicker with incoming data from across human space. The room was built 300 meters underground and could survive a direct nuclear strike. It had been constructed during the last Earth War and never used for its intended purpose. Until now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff from every major Earth nation filled the oval table around her. General Carlos Rodriguez from the Americas sat to her right with his jaw clenched tight. Marshal Lin Chen from the Asian Alliance was reviewing tactical reports with furious concentration. Commander Pierre Dubois from the European Federation looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 24 hours. They had all seen Morrison's report and they had all watched the security footage from New Haven. President Lisa Harper appeared on the main screen from her secure location in Washington. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed the fury burning inside her. She had ordered the assembly of this council within hours of receiving the news, and now she wanted answers. She wanted options. She wanted to know how humanity would respond to the murder of 50,000 innocent people. Sullivan stood and activated the central holographic projector. A three-dimensional map of known space materialized above the table, showing the locations of human colonies in blue and Zilithian territory in red. The Zilithian collective controlled 17 star systems scattered across a region of space, twice the size of human territory. Their population was estimated at 12 billion, based on energy signatures and communication traffic intercepts. The Admiral began her briefing with clinical precision. The Zilithian homeworld of Zilitha Prime was located in the center of their territory and was heavily fortified with orbital defense platforms and a standing fleet of over 3,000 warships. Their technology was primarily biological in nature, with ships grown rather than built, and weapons that used organic processes to generate devastating power. A conventional military campaign against them would require mobilizing every human fleet, and would likely take decades to complete. Casualties would be in the millions, even with optimistic projections. General Rodriguez slammed his fist on the table and demanded to know if Sullivan was suggesting they do nothing. His voice was loud enough to make several officers flinch. He had family members who had been planning to move to New Haven next year. The attack was personal for him. Sullivan raised her hand for calm and continued speaking. She had not finished presenting all the options. There was another way to respond, but it was a path that once taken could never be undone. She looked around the table at each face and saw the same expression on all of them. They wanted justice, and they wanted it delivered with absolute certainty. Colonel Steve Bennett stood up from his position at the back of the room. He was the director of advanced weapons research, and he rarely attended these meetings. His presence meant something significant was about to be discussed. Sullivan nodded to him, and he walked to the front of the room, carrying a sealed briefcase. Bennett opened the case and retrieved a data chip which he inserted into the projection system. A new image appeared showing a complex diagram of what looked like stellar mechanics and quantum field manipulation. The officers around the table leaned forward to study it, but few understood what they were looking at. Bennett began to explain. Project Stellar Killer had been in development for 15 years under the strictest secrecy. It was conceived as a deterrent weapon that would ensure no alien species would ever attempt to exterminate humanity. The theory was based on advanced stellar engineering combined with quantum field manipulation. In simple terms, it was a device that could make a star destroy itself. The room became completely silent. Every person present understood the implications of what Bennett was describing. This was not a weapon designed to win battles or capture territory. This was a weapon designed to erase entire solar systems from existence. Bennett continued his explanation with the calm voice of a scientist discussing a routine experiment. A star was essentially a massive nuclear fusion reactor held together by its own gravity. The fusion process was stable because of the delicate balance between the inward pull of gravity and the outward pressure of the nuclear reactions in the core. If that balance could be disrupted, the star would collapse in on itself, creating a black hole that would consume everything in the system. The Stellar Killer device worked by creating microscopic quantum tunnels in the stellar core that allowed fusion products to escape faster than they should. This disrupted the pressure balance and caused the fusion process to collapse. Once started, the process was irreversible and would complete within 72 hours. The star would implode, and everything within several light hours would be pulled into the resulting black hole. Planets and moons and space stations and ships, everything. President Harper asked the question everyone was thinking. Could this weapon be deployed against the Zilithian systems? Bennett looked at Sullivan before answering. The Admiral nodded and he continued. The original Stellar Killer design required a massive installation that would take years to build. However, recent breakthroughs in miniaturization had allowed the research team to compress the technology into a package the size of a standard torpedo. A single stealth ship could deliver the weapon to a target star without being detected. Multiple ships could strike multiple systems simultaneously. Marshal Chen spoke up and asked how many systems would need to be destroyed to force a Zilithian surrender. Sullivan had already run the simulations. The Zilithian military infrastructure was concentrated in 6 key systems. If those 6 stars were collapsed, the collective would lose 80% of their fleet construction capability and 70% of their military command structure. The remaining systems would be unable to mount any offensive operations and would likely surrender immediately. General Rodriguez asked about casualties. Bennett's expression darkened as he pulled up the population estimates for the 6 target systems. Total Zilithian deaths would be approximately 4 billion. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 4 billion lives in exchange for 50,000. It was a ratio that defied all normal concepts of proportional response. Commander Dubois argued that using such a weapon would make humanity no better than the Zilithians. It would be genocide on a scale that had never been seen in galactic history. The moral cost would be staggering and humanity would be remembered as monsters. Sullivan listened to the arguments that followed and let her officers debate the ethics of what they were considering. She had already made her decision, but she wanted them to voice their concerns. Democracy required that much even in times of war. After an hour of heated discussion, she called for silence. Her voice was steady and cold as she laid out her reasoning. The Zilithians had not attacked a military target. They had deliberately chosen a civilian colony and killed every man, woman, and child they could find. They had done it without warning and without mercy. They had shown humanity exactly what they thought of human life. If Earth responded with conventional warfare, the Zilithians would know they could continue their attacks on colonies while the human military slowly advanced through their territory. More colonies would be destroyed and more innocent people would die. The Zilithians would gamble that humanity lacked the will to fight a long war of attrition. But if Earth responded by erasing 6 of their star systems from existence, the message would be clear and absolute. Any species that committed genocide against humans would face extinction in return. Not eventual defeat, not occupation or reparation, complete and total annihilation. The surviving Zilithians would surrender immediately, and every other species in the galaxy would understand that humanity was not to be threatened. President Harper asked for a vote from the Joint Chiefs. One by one they gave their approval. Some hesitated and some spoke with conviction, but all of them voted yes. The decision was made. Earth would deploy the Stellar Killer weapon against 6 Zilithian star systems, and would do so with maximum speed and efficiency. Sullivan gave the orders to begin preparations. Colonel Bennett was to oversee the final production of 6 stellar killer devices. The stealth ships would be prepared and their crews briefed. Intelligence-gathering missions would identify the optimal delivery points for each target star. The operation was designated Daybreaker and was given the highest priority in human history. Dr. Helen Morris was summoned from her research station on Luna base. She was the lead physicist on the Stellar Killer project and the only person who fully understood the technology. Within 8 hours, she was standing in the war room explaining the final technical details to the assembled commanders. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice remained clear. The Zilithians believed they were dealing with a primitive species that could be intimidated into submission. They had studied human technology and concluded that humans were decades behind them in most areas. They were right about that assessment. Human ships were slower and human weapons were less powerful. But the Zilithians had made one critical error in their evaluation. They had assumed that technological superiority in conventional warfare meant they were safe from human retaliation. They did not understand that humans did not think like other species. Captain Ryan Foster sat in the command chair of the UES Retribution and watched the stars shift as his ship entered Zilithian territory. The Retribution was a stealth vessel designed for deep reconnaissance missions, and it was completely invisible to standard sensor arrays. His crew had been handpicked from the best intelligence officers in the fleet, and they moved through space like ghosts hunting prey. The mission was simple in theory but deadly in execution. Foster and 11 other stealth ships had been tasked with infiltrating Zilithian space and mapping every military installation and defense network they could find. They needed to identify the 6 most critical star systems and determine the best approach vectors for delivering the stellar killer devices. One mistake would alert the Zilithians and cost Earth the element of surprise. Lieutenant Commander Nicole Price sat at the tactical station studying the sensor data as it streamed across her displays. She had served with Foster for 6 years and knew his command style well. He trusted her judgment completely and she had never let him down. Right now, she was tracking 3 Zilithian patrol ships that were passing within 2 million kilometers of their position. The Retribution remained silent and still while the enemy vessels continued on their route without detecting anything unusual. The Zilithians were confident in their superiority, and that confidence made them careless. Their patrol patterns were predictable, and their sensor sweeps were routine. They posted guards at their military stations, but those guards were clearly not expecting any real threats. Foster noted all of this in his tactical logs because it would be useful when the attack began. The first target system was designated Corthan, and it housed the primary Zilithian shipyard. The system orbited a red giant star that had been artificially stabilized by Zilithian technology to provide optimal conditions for growing their bioships. Massive organic structures floated in orbit around the star, absorbing radiation and converting it into the raw materials needed for ship construction. Thousands of vessels in various stages of growth filled the shipyard complex. Foster ordered his crew to deploy micro-drones that would gather detailed scans of the entire system. The drones were smaller than a human fist and were virtually undetectable. They scattered throughout Corthan space and began transmitting data back to the Retribution. Within hours, Foster had a complete map of every ship and station and defensive platform in the system. Nicole identified the critical weakness in the Zilithian defenses. Their entire fleet infrastructure relied on the organic stations that orbited close to the stars. These stations fed on stellar radiation to power their biological processes, and without that energy source they would die. The stations were anchored in stable orbits that had been carefully calculated to maximize energy absorption. If the star collapsed, those stations would be pulled into the black hole along with everything else. Meanwhile, the UES Newton was positioned at the edge of Zilithian space, serving as a mobile research laboratory. Dr. Helen Morris worked around the clock to finalize the stellar killer devices and ensure they would function perfectly when deployed. She had run thousands of simulations, but actual field testing was impossible without revealing the weapon's existence. Everything had to work correctly on the first attempt. Helen stood in the fabrication bay watching the assembly robots put together the 6th and final stellar killer device. Each unit was a cylinder 3 meters long and half a meter in diameter. The outer casing was standard military-grade alloy, but the interior contained quantum field generators and stellar manipulation arrays that represented the cutting edge of human physics. One device could destroy a star, and Helen had just finished building 6 of them. She transmitted a status report to Admiral Sullivan confirming that all 6 devices were ready for deployment. The Admiral responded immediately with orders to begin distribution to the strike teams. Each of the 6 primary stealth ships would receive 1 stellar killer device and would be assigned a specific target system. The coordination had to be perfect because all 6 strikes needed to happen. Within a narrow time window, Captain Foster received his stellar killer device 3 days later during a covert rendezvous with a supply ship at the edge of Zilithian space. The device was loaded into the Retribution's forward torpedo bay and armed with the final activation codes. Foster looked at the weapon through the bay observation port and felt the weight of what he was about to do. This small cylinder would kill billions of Zilithians and destroy an entire solar system. There would be no going back once it was deployed. Commander Alex Turner led the 2nd infiltration team aboard the UES Shadow. His mission was to gather intelligence on Zilithian fleet movements and identify any potential complications that might interfere with Operation Daybreaker. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The Zilithians were mobilizing their entire military force for a massive offensive against human space. Intelligence intercepts revealed that they were planning to attack every human colony in the Outer Rim simultaneously. The attack on New Haven had not been an isolated incident. It had been a test run. The Zilithians intended to exterminate humanity completely, and they believed their superior technology made victory inevitable. Turner transmitted his findings to Earth Command with maximum priority encryption. The message reached Admiral Sullivan within hours and confirmed her worst fears. The Zilithians were not going to negotiate or make demands. They had decided that humanity was a threat that needed to be eliminated, and they were moving to do exactly that. The timeline for Operation Daybreaker was immediately accelerated. Sullivan gave the order for all strike teams to move into final attack positions. There would be no more reconnaissance and no more waiting. The stellar killer devices would be deployed within 48 hours, and the Zilithians would learn the true meaning of human retaliation. Foster guided the Retribution deeper into Corthan's system using a trajectory that would keep them hidden behind the system's outer planets. The approach took 18 hours of careful navigation through asteroid fields and past sensor buoys. Nicole monitored every scanner reading and watched for any sign that they had been detected. The Zilithians remained oblivious to the human presence. The UES Phantom under Captain Sam Mitchell reached its target system first. Mitchell had been a test pilot before joining the intelligence service, and his skills at precision flying were legendary. He brought his ship within 5 million kilometers of the target star and prepared to launch the stellar killer device. His weapons officer, Danny Clark, ran final diagnostics on the torpedo and confirmed all systems were green. Back on Earth, the war room was filled with tension as Admiral Sullivan watched the operation unfold through real-time data feeds from the strike teams. Every screen showed a different target system, and every captain was reporting ready status. President Harper was connected via secure link, and the Joint Chiefs were assembled around the table. They were about to change galactic history forever. Sullivan had spent her entire career preparing for war but hoping it would never come. She had studied every major conflict in human history and understood the terrible cost of violence. She knew that what they were about to do would be remembered for thousands of years. Humanity would be forever marked as the species that could destroy stars. But she also knew that the Zilithians had left them no choice. The alternative was to wait for the Zilithian fleet to arrive at human colonies and repeat what they had done at New Haven across dozens of worlds. Millions of humans would die, and Earth would be forced to fight a desperate defensive war against an enemy with superior technology. The casualties would be catastrophic, and victory would be uncertain. By striking first with overwhelming force, humanity would end the war before it truly began. The Zilithians would lose their ability to wage war and would be forced to surrender. Other alien species watching from the sidelines would learn that humanity was not to be trifled with. It was brutal calculus, but Sullivan had made peace with her decision. Foster received the final attack order and acknowledged with a simple transmission. He looked around the bridge at his crew and saw determination on every face. They all knew what was about to happen, and they all believed it was necessary. The Zilithians had murdered 50,000 innocent humans and were planning to murder millions more. That could not be allowed to stand. Nicole armed the stellar killer torpedo and opened the launch tube. The targeting computer calculated the optimal trajectory for stellar core injection and locked the solution. Foster took a deep breath and gave the order that would doom an entire star system. The torpedo launched from the Retribution and accelerated toward the red giant at the center of Corthan space. Across Zilithian territory, 5 other captains gave the same order within minutes of each other. 6 stellar killer devices fell toward 6 different stars and began their program sequences. The quantum field generators activated as they entered the stellar coronas and started creating microscopic tunnels in the fabric of spacetime. Nuclear fusion products that should have remained trapped in the stellar cores began leaking through those tunnels. The delicate balance that kept the stars stable started to collapse. The Zilithians finally detected the human presence when it was far too late to matter. Their bioships scrambled to intercept the eye. The stellar killer torpedo descended through the outer layers of the Corthan system's red giant star, and Captain Sam Mitchell watched the telemetry data stream across his console. The device was functioning exactly as designed, and the quantum field generators were already beginning to create microscopic disruptions in the stellar core. The process had started and nothing could stop it now. Danny Clark monitored the weapon's progress from his station and called out status updates every 30 seconds. The torpedo had penetrated the chromosphere and was now falling through the convection zone toward the core. The temperature outside the device's shielding was over 2 million degrees, but the protective fields were holding. In another 3 minutes, the weapon would reach the nuclear fusion layer and begin its final sequence. Mitchell ordered emergency acceleration, and the Phantom's engines burned at maximum power as they raced away from the star. Behind them, the Zilithian bioships had finally realized something was wrong and were changing course to intercept, but they were too far away and moving too slowly. The human stealth ship was already approaching the system's edge where they could jump to faster than light speed and escape. The stellar killer device reached the stellar core and activated its quantum field array. Microscopic tunnels opened in spacetime, allowing fusion byproducts to escape from the core at rates that should have been impossible. The pressure balance that kept the star stable began to shift. Deep inside, the red giant nuclear reactions started to falter as their products leaked away through quantum tunnels instead of building up pressure to counteract gravity. The changes were invisible at first. The star looked the same from outside, and its light continued to shine with the same intensity. But sensitive instruments on the Zilithian orbital stations began detecting anomalies in the stellar output. Energy fluctuations appeared that had never been recorded before. Gravitational readings showed strange patterns that made no sense according to their stellar models. Zilithian scientists scrambled to understand what was happening. They ran diagnostics on their monitoring equipment and checked for equipment malfunctions. Everything appeared to be working correctly, which meant the readings were real. The star itself was changing in ways that violated their understanding of stellar physics. Panic began to spread through the scientific community. As they realized something catastrophic was occurring, Dr. Helen Morris sat in the research lab aboard the Newton and watched the same telemetry data that Mitchell was seeing. She had spent 15 years developing the theory behind stellar collapse manipulation, and now she was watching her work become terrifying reality. Her hands shook as she tracked the quantum field strength and calculated the time remaining until total collapse. 71 hours and 18 minutes. That was how long the Corthan system had left to exist. Across Zilithian space, the same process was beginning in 5 other star systems. Captain Ryan Foster had successfully deployed his device in the Zilithian homeworld system and was racing toward the jump point with enemy ships in pursuit. The bioships were firing their plasma weapons, but the range was too great, and the shots dissipated harmlessly in space. Foster's crew cheered as the Retribution crossed the jump threshold and vanished into faster than light. Travel Commander Alex Turner and the Shadow had struck the Zilithian military command system and were being chased by an entire battle group. Turner pushed his engines past their safety limits and felt the ship shudder from the stress. His engineer warned that they were risking a core breach, but Turner knew they just needed to hold together for another 2 minutes. The jump point was directly ahead, and once they crossed it, the Zilithians could not follow. The Shadow jumped with 3 seconds to spare, and the pursuing battle group was forced to break off their chase. Turner allowed himself a moment of relief before focusing on the next phase. They needed to get far away from Zilithian space before the stars started collapsing. The gravitational effects would be catastrophic for several light years in every direction. Back in the Corthan system, the orbital stations were experiencing increasing problems. The bioships docked for repairs and refueling were detecting power fluctuations in the energy feeds they received from the stations. The stations themselves were anchored in orbits calculated to maximize their exposure to stellar radiation. Now that radiation was becoming unstable and the delicate biological systems that converted it to usable energy were starting to fail, the Zilithian High Command received reports from all 6 affected systems within hours of the attacks. Their military analysts reviewed the data and came to a horrifying conclusion. The humans had somehow weaponized stellar mechanics and were causing the stars to collapse. The technology required for such a feat was decades beyond what they had believed humans possessed. It was a complete intelligence failure of catastrophic proportions. Emergency evacuation orders were issued for all 6 threatened systems, but the Zilithians quickly realized the futility of the effort. They had billions of people living on planets and stations throughout those systems. Their ships could not possibly evacuate everyone in the time remaining. Even if they tried, the gravitational effects of the collapsing stars would tear apart any vessels that got too close. Foster opened his communication channel again and broadcast his message across all Zilithian frequencies. He wanted them to understand exactly what was happening and why. He explained in simple terms that 6 of their stars were going to collapse within the next 72 hours. The collapse would create black holes that would consume everything in those systems. Planets and moons and stations and ships would all be pulled into the event horizons and destroyed. He told them that this was the price for destroying New Haven Colony. Humanity did not start this war, but humanity would end it in a way that ensured no species would ever threaten them again. The Zilithians had believed humans were weak and primitive. They were learning the truth now. Humans were not weak. They were terrifying when pushed to their limits. The first stellar collapse began 18 hours after the stellar killer devices were deployed. The red giant in the Corthan system had been losing mass through the quantum tunnels at an accelerating rate. The fusion reactions in the core finally reached a critical threshold and failed completely. Without the outward pressure of fusion to counteract gravity, the star imploded. The collapse happened faster than the Zilithian scientists had predicted. The star compressed from a sphere hundreds of times larger than Earth to a point of infinite density in less than 10 minutes. The process released more energy than the star had produced in the previous million years, and that energy burst outward in a shockwave that incinerated everything. Within a light hour, the 3 innermost planets of the Corthan system were vaporized instantly. The massive shipyard stations orbiting the star were torn apart by tidal forces before being pulled into the forming black hole. Thousands of bioships in various stages of construction were dragged into the event horizon along with the stations that had grown them. The Zilithian workers and engineers and military personnel on those stations never had time to escape or even understand what was happening. Helen Morris watched the astronomical data coming from long-range telescopes and felt tears running down her face. She had created this weapon to protect humanity, but seeing the results of her work made her sick. 4 billion Zilithians were going to die because of the mathematics she had developed in her laboratory. The fact that it was justified did not make it easier to bear. Admiral Sullivan stood in the war room and watched the holographic displays update as the first star collapsed. The red indicator for the Corthan system winked out and was replaced by a black sphere representing the new black hole. Around the table, the Joint Chiefs sat in silence. They had voted for this action, and they stood by that decision, but watching it happen was different from approving it in theory. The second star collapsed 6 hours later. Then the third and fourth in rapid succession. The Zilithian communication networks were flooded with desperate messages as people in the doomed systems tried to say goodbye to their families and friends in other parts of the collective. Some sent messages of hate toward humanity. Others simply expressed their grief and fear. All of them knew they were going to die. The Zilithian High Command attempted to organize a military response but found their options extremely limited. Half of their fleet construction capability had just been destroyed, along with most of their military leadership. The admirals and generals who had planned the campaign against humanity were dead. The bioships that were supposed to carry out those attacks no longer existed. President Harper received a priority transmission on the emergency diplomatic channel. The message was from the Zilithian High Hierarch, and it was a plea for mercy. The aliens' bioluminescent skin patterns were translated by the computers as expressions of absolute terror and desperation. The hierarch begged Earth to stop the attacks and promised complete surrender. Sullivan reviewed the message and consulted with her staff. The remaining 2 stellar killer devices had been deployed and were already disrupting their target stars. The process could not be reversed even if humanity wanted to stop it. She drafted a response explaining that the weapon systems were irreversible once activated. The 6th star. Admiral Kate Sullivan stood in the command center and watched the final report stream in from reconnaissance teams scattered across the border regions. 6 Zilithian star systems had gone dark, and their signatures had been replaced by the unmistakable gravitational readings of black holes. The weapon had worked exactly as designed, and the devastation was absolute. 4 billion Zilithians were gone, and their military infrastructure had been completely destroyed. The remaining Zilithian systems had ceased all military operations within hours of the first collapse. Their bioships had retreated to defensive positions around their homeworld and were broadcasting surrender signals on every communication frequency. The Zilithian High Hierarch sent message after message begging for a ceasefire and offering unconditional terms. The tone of desperation in those transmissions was impossible to miss. President Lisa Harper convened an emergency session of the United Earth Assembly to discuss the terms of Zilithian surrender. Representatives from every colony and every nation gathered in the Great Hall to debate what humanity's response should be. Some argued for total occupation of Zilithian space. Others demanded reparations that would cripple their economy for generations. A few voices called for mercy and restraint, but those voices were drowned out by calls for justice, Commander. Jake Morrison had returned to Earth and was asked to testify before the assembly about what he had witnessed at New Haven Colony. He stood at the speaker's podium and described in detail the systematic murder of 50,000 innocent people. He showed images of the destroyed shelters and the burned remains of homes. He played audio recordings of the final messages sent by colonists as they realized they were going to die. The assembly hall was silent when he finished. Harper took the podium after Morrison and addressed the gathered representatives. She spoke about the responsibility that came with possessing weapons like the Stellar Killer. Humanity had demonstrated that it could destroy entire solar systems and that power came with a terrible burden. The galaxy was watching to see what Earth would do next. Would humanity become conquerors who used their weapons to dominate others, or would they prove that the destruction of the Zilithian systems was a justified response to genocide and nothing more? The debate lasted for 3 days, and the arguments were passionate on all sides. In the end, the assembly voted to accept the Zilithian surrender with conditions. The collective would pay reparations to the families of New Haven victims. They would establish memorial stations at each of the 6 collapsed star systems. They would open their territory to human observers who would ensure they never rebuilt their military to threatening levels. And most importantly, they would broadcast across the galaxy a full admission of their crimes and an acknowledgement that humanity's response had been justified. The Zilithian High Hierarch appeared on every view screen across human space to deliver that admission. The aliens' bioluminescent patterns flickered with colors that the translation computers labeled as shame and fear. The Hierarch spoke about the terrible mistake the collective had made in attacking New Haven. They had believed humans were weak because they sought peace. They had not understood that choosing peace and being capable of war were 2 different things. The galaxy watched that broadcast and drew their own conclusions. Dozens of alien species that had previously dismissed humanity as insignificant suddenly became very interested in establishing diplomatic relations. Trade offers flooded into Earth's embassies. Non-aggression treaties were proposed by governments that had never acknowledged human existence before. The message was clear. Humanity had proven itself to be the most dangerous species in known space, and everyone wanted to be on friendly terms. Dr. Helen Morris retired from government service 3 months after the war ended. She moved to a small research station on the edge of human space where she spent her remaining years trying to find a way to reverse stellar collapse. The mathematics suggested it might be possible to stabilize a collapsing star if the intervention happened early enough. She never succeeded, but the work gave her some measure of peace. She died 15 years later, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of scientists who had worked with her over the decades. Captain Ryan Foster returned to active duty but requested a transfer away from intelligence operations. He was given command of a diplomatic escort vessel and spent the next 20 years helping establish peaceful relations with alien species across the frontier. He never spoke publicly about his role in Operation Daybreaker, but the weight of what he had done never left him. In his private journals, he wrote about the conflict between duty and conscience and wondered if the deaths of 4 billion beings could ever truly be justified. The ruins of New Haven Colony were preserved exactly as they had been found. The United Earth government declared the entire system a protected memorial site and prohibited any development or salvage operations. A massive monument was constructed in orbit around the colony world, with the names of all 50,000 victims inscribed on panels that stretched for kilometers. Visitors came from across human space to pay their respects and remember what had been lost. 6 additional monuments were built at the locations where the Zilithian star systems had existed. These were more controversial because they commemorated the deaths of 4 billion aliens. Some humans argued that the Zilithians deserved no memorial after what they had done. Others believed that remembering the cost of war was important, even when the dead were enemies. The monuments were built despite the controversy, and each bore a simple inscription about the price of genocide. Commander Alex Turner took a position training new intelligence officers at the military academy on Mars. He taught classes on reconnaissance tactics and strategic planning, but he also taught about the ethics of warfare. His students learned about the importance of accurate intelligence and the consequences of miscalculation. Turner used the Zilithian War as a case study in how quickly conflicts could escalate when both sides misunderstood each other's capabilities and intentions. The Zilithian collective never recovered its former power. The loss of 6 star systems and 4 billion people left scars that lasted for generations. Their remaining population lived under the watchful eyes of human observers, and their economy struggled under the weight of reparation payments. Some Zilithians harbored resentment toward humanity, but most simply wanted to rebuild their lives and avoid any action that might trigger another human response. Younger Zilithians who had been children during the war grew up in a society forever changed by what had happened. They learned about the attack on New Haven and about the terrible retaliation that followed. Many of them worked to establish better relations with humanity and to ensure that the mistakes of their elders were never repeated. Cultural exchange programs were started, and some Zilithians even moved to human colonies to study and work alongside the species their government had once tried to exterminate. Admiral Sullivan retired 5 years after the war and wrote her memoirs about the decision to deploy the stellar killer weapon. The book was controversial and generated intense debate about military ethics and proportional response. Sullivan defended her decision but acknowledged the moral complexity of what had been done. She argued that the Zilithians had forced humanity's hand by planning to exterminate every human colony. The choice had been between allowing millions of humans to die or ensuring that no species would ever attempt such an attack again. The scientific community debated the implications of stellar collapse technology for decades. Some researchers wanted to continue developing the stellar killer as a deterrent against future threats. Others argued that the weapon was too dangerous to exist and should be dismantled. In the end, the Earth government decided to maintain a small stockpile of the devices, but placed them under the strictest controls in human history. No single person or government could authorize their use. Any deployment would require unanimous approval from the United Earth Assembly. Other alien species attempted to develop their own versions of the stellar killer technology but found the physics far more complex than they had anticipated. Human scientists had made breakthroughs in quantum field manipulation that other species had not achieved. This technological advantage became another factor in humanity's growing influence across the galaxy. Species that might have challenged human expansion decided that cooperation was a better strategy than confrontation. The war changed humanity in ways that went beyond military power. Before the conflict, humans had been uncertain about their place in a galaxy filled with older and seemingly more advanced species. After demonstrating what they were capable of when threatened, that uncertainty disappeared. Humans walked through the galaxy with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they could defend themselves against any threat. Trade routes expanded, and human colonies spread to new star systems. The population living in space grew exponentially as people sought opportunities on frontier worlds. Earth remained the cultural and political center of human civilization, but the colonies developed their own identities and contributions. Humanity was becoming a true spacefaring species, and the destruction of New Haven had paradoxically accelerated that transformation by proving that humans belonged among the stars.